You're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. With me today is Karim Hijazi. Karim is the CEO and founder of Prevailion, which is modernizing supply chain security through the use of evidence of compromise rather than indicators of compromise. Karim, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate having me.
You started school at the University of Texas before later graduating from USC in 1997. It was 4 years until you started your first company, Demiurge Consulting. What did that gap look like?
Interesting gap. So I actually went to school, believe it or not, for photography, and it was right around the time that photography was shifting into being more computer-driven. Adobe had pioneered Photoshop. A lot of the technology that was coming into play then was really interesting. A far cry from security, obviously. And then I even departed further from that. In fact, Demiurge Consulting was originally a competitive intelligence consultancy to start with. It wasn't actually a counter intel firm. That's actually what it morphed into later. But to answer your question, the gap was predominantly me traveling around, really trying to figure out where I wanted to land as far as doing anything. It wasn't even about security or competitive intel or photography. I did move to New York. I did spend some time as a photographer's assistant there. I did end up going back overseas, believe it or not, to the Middle East for a period of time where I was working in an office where they were still using fax machines. And I thought, wow, you guys don't have a website, you don't have email going. How are you guys possibly corresponding with the Western world? And so I took it upon myself to help them get spun up with everything I just mentioned. And that was back in the days when Windows NT was coming online. And this is, again, kind of a weird chicken and egg problem. I had to buy books to read how to set up a network with coaxial cables and all kinds of stuff to get them spun up so I could have internet to research more about how to get things configured even further. And then shortly thereafter, I got the competitive intelligence side of Demiurge going. And that was more or less tied to the business I was associated with, which was oil and gas. So we were helping that organization specifically assess what their competitors were doing from a competitive intelligence standpoint. That carried on all the way through to the early 2000s. And right around that time, I moved back to the US. And that's when Demiurge took a shift over to the other side. And it was inspired, and hopefully this will give you some clues to how I got to security, by one very interesting comment I had over a beer with a friend of mine who was actually at the helm of a very large security company at the time called Internet Security Systems in Atlanta. And he said, well, why don't you just simply offer counter intel? And I was like, that's an interesting proposition. And he said, look, you're helping organizations find information they need to win deals. You have to believe there's other organizations out there doing the exact same thing against them, just like you. Why don't you provide them context on what that might happen? Effectively hire a thief to protect you from a thief, right? And that's sort of how it was born. And from that point on, it carried on in that fashion.
So what inspired you to start a consultancy like Demiurge rather than joining an existing one at that time?
Yeah, it's a good question. My father was an entrepreneur. That sort of those genes carried on with me. I always had sort of an interest in being a consultant. That seemed like the dream job back in my early 20s. It was the idea of kind of being, my own boss, being able to travel around where and when I wanted, being able to sort of be needed for the advice I could provide was a very inspiring idea. I look back on those days and think, wow, that was an exhausting period of time. Now, not to say that what I do now isn't any less tiring, but what's interesting is as a consultant, I think getting into it, you sort of look at this and these rose-colored glasses saying, well, this is going to be nothing but fun, and you're going to meet a lot of people, and they're going to want you for your capabilities and understanding of things. The reality is it's just not a very scalable thing, unfortunately. You're selling yourself by the pound. You are the product, which is, again, depending on where you are in your career path, it's a very interesting proposition. But then as you mature and you realize, wait a second, if I'm going to really achieve any level of substantial wealth, you got to be able to disembody some sort of product from yourself to be able to deliver to the customer rather than just simply selling yourself. You have to create a brand effectively, right? And I didn't know that very well then. Back then, it was really effectively me being able to help get my bona fides up to snuff and really get people to understand that I had something to offer.
But you did keep with it for several years until 2010. What did that growth look like as you tried to expand the capabilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I never once in that time frame really seriously considered moving from consulting into trying to build some sort of solution or product, right? Because it felt like such a different world. There were certainly things that came about in the course of those years that probably could have been memorialized into being a product. It was only at the very sort of end of the Demiurge timeframe where that effort sort of manifested into, hey, this could be something that I could spin up as a completely separate solution that could be then, again, to my point earlier, disembodied from myself and eventually sold to a customer at scale. So I could build it once and sell it many times versus sort of being this bespoke consultant per customer request, which was, again, very taxing. And, I had a slew of consultants that were with me within Demiurge toward the end. But again, it had a limit, right? There was only so much I could effectively manage. I wasn't trying to build the next, massive consultancy. I was really trying to stay a boutique firm. So when the idea of building a product came about and it was a viable thing that seemed like it could actually take hold, it was pretty exciting. Now, I had no business building a product then. I didn't know how. It was all trial by fire and trial and error. But it was fairly intuitive, the idea that we had, and ultimately it worked. But that really was an impossible thing to carry on both of the time. I realized just how much effort goes into actually building something that you have to sort of sell to a customer. And so that forced the effort for me to shut down the consultancy and go full time with Unbalance.
Right. And that was back in 2010.
Correct.
What was really the mission of Unbalance?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, as it relates back to the Demiurge days, I was watching very closely the rise of effectively some of these more commodity botnets, if you want to call them that. Things like the Mariposa botnet. Prior to that, there were things like Stormbot, which were primarily a government concern. There wasn't as much mainstream, interest or awareness of it, I should say, not so much interest. And that really kind of inspired the idea that if we could find ways to help understand the adversary a little more, figure out what their objectives and intentions are with these botnets, that would be very fruitful. And if we could then further impact them in some way that could be programmatic, that would be even more incredible. And that would be something that people would buy. So really what Unbalance provided was intelligence around who is victimized by these botnets. And this is actually another very interesting misstep that I'm sure the listeners will find interesting. As a consultant, you're hired for your advice and your expertise, right? So you're technically paid to give them whatever news is the truth, right? Here's the information, now pay my bill. And they're usually hiring you because they want that. They're asking for it. So it's solicited. With Unbalance, we were collecting telemetry and information around who was victimized by these groups and trying to tell them that we had this information and get them to want it and buy that information. And it was a completely different experience because we were effectively going to organizations telling them, hey, you probably don't know that you're actually compromised, but you are. Don't you want to buy this wonderful information about how terrible your network is right now? And we got the complete opposite experience with them wanting it. So it was a very, very hard knock, coming from the consulting world where you're usually, brought in a sort of lofty capacity and people respect your opinions. This was going in and trying to peddle what felt like peddling information that people didn't want to see anyway. It was more information they just already was considered bad news and they didn't want to see it. So lesson learned very quickly that just because it's really good intel doesn't mean it's going to sell instantly. So it took a while for us to get our ground under us a little bit stabilized to be able to get that working.
Right. And as a part of your battle against botnets, you ended up getting the attention of Lulzsec. What did that look like?
That was quite a surprise. So in 2011, that was quite the year for Anonymous and the whole WikiLeaks mess and everything else. All of that is woven together to this story. And I'll never forget it. I think it was Super Bowl Sunday of that year. And that was when HB Gary got hit really hard, HB Gary Federal specifically. And, the entire security community, were rallied around that effort, kind of like, wow, what just happened? And it was an attack on them by what was considered sort of a faction of Anonymous that went after them, and went after Aaron Barr, and a few of the other folks associated with that company, fairly public. And I remember seeing that going, wow, it's awful. I feel bad for these guys. I hate to be in their position. And then lo and behold, May rolls around, and we ended up getting these interesting sort of extortive emails suggesting that they had hacked into our environment, even though there was really no evidence to support that, but just fear tactics and whatnot to sort of get us to comply. And I ended up in this very long, sort of dragged on argument with them online, obviously with the surveillance of law enforcement with me at the time, unbeknownst to them, that facilitated their takedown eventually. So it was a pretty interesting time frame, but it was precarious for us because they were spectacular Twitter jockeys, so they were able to kind of spin a narrative out there that suggested things were going on that may not have been. And the good news for us, obviously, is that I made the choice to go very public with the attack, unlike some of the larger companies that just don't have the means to do that. And it worked in our favor. That doesn't always happen, as we all know with media. You can either take a turn in the wrong direction or the right direction. In our case, people very much could see that this was something that was, these guys spinning a story out about us. And shortly thereafter, we got the attention of some of the more substantial security companies like Mandiant and CrowdStrike, and we exited.
Right. And so you then, like you just said, sold to Mandiant in 2012. And this is now 11 years after starting your first consultancy back at Demiurge. What was
Correct.
it like all of a sudden to no longer be an entrepreneur?
Total shift. It was a very interesting experience. Mandiant was an amazing place to work, albeit a shorter period of time than I would have probably liked because of all the things that happened in that time frame. Just as, serendipitously, Mandiant was positioning toward the end of my tenure there to be sold to FireEye. So a lot of what was going on within the company was probably a little bit different than what it would have been had I sort of been acquired maybe 2 or 3 years earlier. I would have been able to spend a little more time getting things going. But there are parts of it that were very enjoyable. I mean, I think that, entrepreneurial life is challenging. People that don't do it think it's quite easy. You just run around with a nice new shiny cell phone and, you really kind of have all the free time in the world, which is completely untrue. You're really working almost constantly. It takes a massive toll on everything, friendships, relationships. You're really never out of the game. Your head's always in it, whether you're at home or wherever. So working at Mandiant did provide a new construct, which was that I could sort of shut off toward the end of the day. Even though I had some fairly substantial responsibilities, it was still a larger company than just me. I didn't run the entire show, and that was a relieving factor. Now, I will say that I'm saying that now as an entrepreneur again, building my own company again. So I'm lusting after those days again. But quite candidly, shortly after I was acquired, I got the itch again, and I was like, oh man, I could go out and I could probably build something else, and this could be great. And you get these delusions of grandeur about how easy it really could be, even though it wasn't. It's my wife and I have a joke because she says that you're just like a woman that just had a baby. Your brain forgets how painful that pregnancy and that birth was, and you're ready to jump right back in. And she's like, you gotta videotape it next time. So we have this ongoing joke that is very similar to that.
Interesting. So you left Mandiant in 2013, and you later started Prevailion in 2017. So what happened in those 4 years?
Yeah, so I left Mandiant literally about a month before FireEye acquired the company. So it was pretty interesting. I probably would have gone from big to even bigger, conceivably. But in that time frame, I did try my hand at a variety of different things. I sort of wanted to expand my awareness of different areas of technology. It wasn't just security, which was a good experiment, for lack of a better term, because a couple things were learned in that time frame. While technology is amazing because really anyone can effectively learn it and leverage something if you've got a good idea, you can't discount your connectivity in the industries that you're steeped in, because that is a critical part of your success. So in some of the areas that I was trying in that time frame, I was trying things like marketing intelligence. I was looking at different things tied to machine learning, all these emerging technologies that were coming about that were really interesting, that could foster some incredible innovation. Building the tech was not actually the problem. What was challenging was approaching folks that didn't know who I was in a fresh industry, suggesting that, hey, my experience in the security and intelligence realm can be applied here, trust me. And it took a while for them to sort of buy into that, if at all. So part of what was learned then was that even if you have the best idea in the world, or you can build the best technology in the world, if you don't have the connectivity into that specific stovepipe of the industry, you're going to have a hard time, no matter how successful you might be. Because I was quite, personally, wealthy at that point. I could do it on my own. I didn't need investors. I valued the importance of having investors in a specific space. They can certainly open doors for you if you get the right ones. That's a big part of the equation. They give you credibility for what you're doing. So that's probably one of the biggest lessons I learned in that time frame.
Right. So then you started Prevailion in 2017. It sounds like moving back to the security space where you had those connections. What was the idea in starting Prevailion? How did that differ from Unbalance, who were ultimately addressing a fairly similar mission?
Yeah, so it's a good point. So Unbalance was addressing a similar methodology as far as understanding what was going on from an adversarial standpoint. So that part was similar. So our sort of framework and idea of how to target the adversarial part of the infrastructure versus looking for victims, or quote unquote whack-a-moling, trying to find out where this guy is within the victim. The idea was to go, no, let's go look the other direction. Let's see where they're setting up their command and control infrastructure and pursue it. So that part was indeed, from a base thesis perspective, similar. What differed entirely was that Prevailion was founded, and it's funny saying this now post the SolarWinds hack, Kyle, but we were founded on the idea of helping organizations understand the risks associated with supply chain. That was our entire thesis around Prevailion. So even back in late 2016 and 17, and when I got the first MVP going, the whole premise was, let me help an organization look at their partner ecosystem and discern who might be considered contagious, or which organizations might render them some sort of compromise if they continue to stay connected, or what organization could represent a risk if you acquire them, right? Sort of akin to like a Yahoo Verizon situation, or a Marriott SPG problem, where they kind of ingest a poison pill organization that has an existing compromise that then laterally moves into their main network. And that was the idea. So with Unbalance, we never once sort of offered up the idea that you could look at anyone but yourself. This was entirely different. This was prevent entirely the compromise altogether, if you can, by limiting or at least throttling the exposure to the compromised entity that you're working with, versus using it in some sort of triage capacity, the way Unbalance was used within Mandiant.
Interesting. So thinking back to the early days of Prevailion and getting it off the ground there, you mentioned previously how you had this personal wealth that you'd acquired through Unbalance, but you also recognized the value of investors. And you did opt to progress through a seed round. What was the thinking there?
Yeah, so couple thoughts. One, the lesson learned from, as you mentioned, those 4 years in between Unbalance and Prevailion were quite influencing. The fact that I needed people that were, again, really deeply connected within the industry. I needed validation in a lot of ways too. So you can build it, even though I could have gone to all of my friends within the industry and said, hey, look, you remember me from the old days. I built something really cool. Take a look at this thing. They would probably believe me, but I need everyone else that doesn't know me to sort of look at this as something valuable and that could be usable. So getting an investor, in this case with our seed round, it was with Data Tribe out of Maryland, which was a fantastic, first investor in the equation, because they were founded on some key principles around the type of industry and technology that we were specifically in, which was intelligence, data science. And so that fit nicely. And then the fact that they would be a sort of louder platform to suggest that, hey, look, we took the chance and invested X amount of money into this right off the bat with a fairly, basic MVP, proved out a lot of what we had to offer pretty quickly. People looked in our direction a lot faster than it would have if it was simply me standing on a soapbox proclaiming I'd built the best, supply chain risk platform ever. So that was a big motivation there. Not to mention, I had spent a fair bit of my own personal, wealth on some of these former experiments. And so, on a personal level, I wasn't ready to go expend that much more of my personal money on this initiative, just no matter how much I believed in it. It was at that point a little bit too much of a personal risk at that point. Right.
So what did the growth of Prevailion from those early days look like compared to, again, Unbalance?
Very different, very different. So Unbalance was primarily bootstrapped. That was indeed something that was exactly what I mentioned I didn't want to do this time, which is
right.
I'm going to build it. I'm going to spend my money on it and try to get people to understand what this is and hopefully, slowly but surely gain inertia and sell a lot of it, which really we never had the time to really see that through. Got acquired much, much too fast to be able to see that happen. With Prevailion, the challenge there was not that people were upset about hearing about their own compromises, kind of like what we encountered with Unbalance. But what we noticed was, and we still are feeling it to some degree today, people are not even sure where to begin when it comes to a partner that's compromised. They're still in the throes of dealing with their own issues versus something that has to do with a partner on the outside. Now, very relevant topic. I mean, SolarWinds completely came out of the left field for a lot of people. They're like, wow, would never have thought that a third party could be so terrible in terms of attacks, right? So we knew, obviously, had been studying this for years, that's the perfect vector of infection. If you don't have to go through the front door of an organization and you come in through a trusted channel, that's the better option. I think what we faced early days with Prevailion was, how do we differ from existing solutions that were they were using similar narratives? Supply chain risk was primarily wrapped around vulnerabilities of your third parties, not so much their compromise status. So we had to shift the narrative and shift people's perceptions that, no, we're not vulnerability scanning these organizations and then telling you that, hey, you're working with someone that has a potential exploitability available to them. We are saying, you are dealing with an organization that is already compromised. So it would be the equivalency of saying, I'm not sitting with my friend Kyle who has a weak immune system. I'm sitting with my friend Kyle that unfortunately is asymptomatic but has COVID. So I probably ought to slightly depart from him for now until he feels better. And so the narrative sort of manifested, and of course the pandemic also assisted with that narrative as well, as bizarre as that sounds.
Now, you mentioned SolarWinds, and we do have to go back to that for a second, just because that is so intertwined with Prevailion's mission. Sure. What has the last month looked like for you since that incident?
Oh, absolutely manic, for lack of a better term. I think that the amount of interviews and conversations I've had all through the holidays and even as late as 11:56 p.m. New Year's Eve with someone about it has been incredible. It's a tragic situation without question, because it really was the ultimate explanation of why this is a risk, right? You've got something that has a pervasive footprint and effectively a lateral movement access point for an adversary, and that adversary did a lot of studying to figure out that was the perfect target to do that. So our conversations have been primarily around SolarWinds is a good lesson, but it is certainly the beginning of a greater problem. Prevailion's focus hasn't been so much the SolarWinds portion of the problem. It's been the after effects. It's been all the deployment of every other type of backdoor or Trojan or malware. FireEye's named several of these, one of them called Teardrop, post a sunburst infection within the first doorway being opened. All this other stuff was facilitated into these organizations that people don't quite know about yet. We're still learning what those are. So our focus has been primarily, okay, if you were a victim of this, what is happening, what is lurking within your environment, what can Prevailion tell you as far as what's beaconing from your environment out to a command and control infrastructure that you others wouldn't know about, So our conversations have been absolutely crazy. It's still challenging for organizations to immediately know what to do. Again, back to the idea of good intel is fantastic, but now you got to be able to leverage it, right? So there's a lot of information that we impart that still kind of needs the right talent aboard these organizations or the consultants to be hired to help facilitate, because that's a big part of this, is the expertise to execute on the intelligence we create is still lacking.
And as an expert in the space with a solution that's targeted almost specifically at this problem, how did you balance using the opportunity to gain additional revenue with just helping US companies and agencies who you recognized were severely impacted by this?
It's always a balancing act with a for-profit startup, because you really, as much as you may want on an altruistic level just to kind of give them everything they need, just go and fix and do all that. And you have to some degree. It's absolutely incumbent on you, if you're a professional and you have intelligence that can be supporting, a supporting capability in that case, to do that. Akin to what happened with SolarWinds was the whole the hospitals that were attacked by the ransomware groups, right? If you remember that, that was the big story effectively a month and a half prior to the SolarWinds mess. We did a lot of work with the CTI League, if you're familiar with who they are. They were a nonprofit, or in this case, at the very early stages, it was a volunteer group that got together of several thousand security professionals that decided to just band together, share intelligence, and help these hospitals out. We did a lot there. We felt that was a very, very noble and worthy cause, and really, if anything, it was more of a visceral, emotional reaction to these hackers taking advantage of hospitals that are trying to help sick people. That was pretty infuriating across the board. With SolarWinds, similarly, we're trying to help organizations understand. We had a model with our platform to begin with, which is fortuitous, that we actually offered free access to your own organization within Prevailion. So if you wanted to see if you indeed had something there, you could just simply get free access to it. Now, the minute you want to look at anyone else but yourself, you would pay. So the beauty of it is that our model by design, not in response to these situations, was ideal for these things that have happened. So we were able to say, hey, look, not coming here to sell anything. We actually have the model built so you can actually get some intelligence right off the bat. Have at it. And so it kind of worked out perfectly in that regard.
Great. And earlier in 2020, you'd already had somewhat of a big year. You were named a cool vendor of 2020 by Gartner. What did that mean to you and the team?
Oh, it was incredible. Gartner is the absolute, kind of 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to third-party recognition and validation from an analyst perspective. And so really appreciate their interest in the company. Some fantastic analysts that we had spoken with that really saw what we had as kind of the next bastion of problems to address. And so I think their understanding of it really helped catapult our, general awareness out there quite a bit. And, getting named a cool vendor was quite an honor. So we're still reeling from that right now. It's been an exciting time. And I think we'll feel the effects of that even more in this year than we did even last, because I think people will start saying, okay, what's even out there that addresses this? Now, of course, Gartner did have to indeed put us within a specific category. We do live within the greater umbrella of threat intel, but they themselves even recognize that we're really compromise intelligence, which is a different sort of subset that's much more sort of evidentiary than just sort of an IOC-based feed of some kind. So that's been really, really exciting.
Now, that label is obviously a very public award that Prevailion received. Thinking back on the last 4 years since starting Prevailion, what were some of the other key victories?
I think early customer acquisition and the kinds of customers, some of which unfortunately I can't share publicly, but
no problem.
The ones that were extremely interested right off the bat really validated what we had to offer. I think that's what kept the steam in our stride. Because, while I did mention that there are lots of companies that still don't know quite what to do with the intel, or they feel like they're a little bit like, oh my gosh, this is a whole other layer that I hadn't even considered that's going to be a problem because I don't have the resources on hand. So we feel for those companies because we're actually sort of suggesting that this is, something they have to pay attention to. The existing customers that we did get that came on were really, really forward looking. They did have the resources. They use the intelligence incredibly well. And then the second thing that was incredibly eye opening, well, actually there's three, so I'll tell you all three. The second thing was the fact that some of these organizations actually helped validate that our intelligence could be used for profit versus, being a cost center. Because as we all know, security and intelligence tends to generally live in this begrudging purchase by an organization because they have to either adhere to some sort of compliance standard, or they have had a compelling event. Now they're forced to sort of beef up their security, which is a little bit of an unfortunate way to get sold, right? Because you're coming in because you're sort of they're finally conceding that they need to have it. Or they're just simply trying to avoid some sort of penalty. They're doing it sort of for lip service. I think it's changing more and more now, but at least back then, it was still very much this. We got to buy this stuff, so I guess we're going to buy it.
Right.
Our intel allowed organizations to make decisions on who and what they might work with or whom they might actually acquire, to where they could use our intelligence to throttle the deal terms or alter them. So they were actually using our intelligence to profit, which was really incredible. So now, in any deal like that, there's a bit of a winner and loser. So I do understand that our intelligence could have resulted in someone getting less money than they would have hoped for in their selling of their organization. But for the buyer, it was a huge win. And that dovetails into my third aspect, which is we had a huge impact on the way the cyber insurance organizations looked at things, because we could be used in two capacities. One, by the insurance company to decide from an actuarial standpoint who is insurable, or we could be used by people with insurance policies to force a claim to be paid because we had the evidence to support the claim. So we kind of worked both sides of the angle there, and we continue to do so. This is obviously an emerging business that we think is going to be absolutely massive. I've been waiting for cyber insurance to really take hold for 20 years. I've watched it from the early 2000s, and now it seems like we might be one of the major pillars within the equation for them to have the actuarial data they need to actually have a completely viable product that is more far-reaching than it is today.
Right. It'll be interesting to see what the cyber insurance industry does in the next handful of years here.
Definitely.
Now, conversely, you mentioned the challenges that you went through with some of your earlier ventures. I can't imagine you were able to completely avoid those with Prevailion. So what were some of the key ones that stuck out as you kicked off?
Yeah, so you always need more money and more people. Well, I shouldn't say more people. You need more specific talent than you think you might need right off the bat. Sure. Marketing is forever underrated, especially in our space. Cybersecurity, if you look at some of the greats that really got themselves up there in terms of awareness, it's the guys that really spent a lot of time making sure that there was a lot of general awareness of their capabilities, which paid off substantially. And it's a very expensive proposition. So getting the branding and marketing right for your organization is a big deal. I know we all in this space tend to really focus on the capability and the tech and the actual technology that does the job, which is obviously very, very critical. But if no one knows about it, then you tend to fall flat, right? There's thousands of fantastic technologies that die every day because no one knows about them. So that's a big part of the equation that I don't think anyone ever gets right perfectly, no matter how much you need to do it. So even with Prevailion, with the best intentions of trying to make sure that our brand was right and that we had the broadest reach possible and the loudest bullhorn about what we're doing possible, we still didn't get enough outreach out there to get people to understand what we had. And sometimes that's almost impossible to do yourself. You need a confluence of events to happen. You need things, unfortunately, like what happened at the end of last year between the ransomware attacks and then SolarWinds, to gain momentum so people sort of see who you are and get that recognition. So it's not always on your watch, right? You gotta sort of wait for the right time. I think assembling the right kinds of teams is very challenging. When you have an investment team behind you, they expect you to look, smell, and feel like a certain thing by a certain time. And that's an important thing to recognize. They're not wrong. You absolutely have to be at the right place at the right time in order to be taken seriously. So if you're slow on a certain front, if you're slow with building the right kind of team out, or if your revenues aren't up to snuff to the right time that you're at, you might not look as appealing to the next round of investors, right? So that's another aspect of things that was quite different than what happened with Unbalance or what happened with my other ventures in between. That was a learning curve that I had to adjust to, that I continue to adjust to even now. Keeping your eye on the ball. What's your ultimate agenda with the organization? Do you want to just simply get something to be a feature add to another organization, or do you want to ultimately become a big company on your own? And sometimes that's in your control and sometimes it's not. I think with Prevailion, it was abundantly clear between myself and the investors that we wanted to build a very self-sustaining, independent organization that could, function on its own. And that's happened, which we're very grateful that it has. But in many cases, losing that focus as a founder can really throw you off. If you don't know what you're building, are you building to exit or are you building to eventually go IPO? Getting that squared away early is important. I think that's another thing that it's easy to kind of stray when you get a lot of folks with cooks in the kitchen, if you will.
I think that's a great segue. Looking ahead for Prevailion, what's next? And you specifically just mentioned that exit versus IPO. What do you see as the future for Prevailion in the next year and ahead?
Yeah, so we're continuing to do really well. I think this year will be probably our best year, obviously, ever, considering, it's pretty obvious, I think, to everyone that we're about the only solution out there that addresses this exact issue. So I think we're going to get a lot more attention as time goes on with this, and we'll continue to refine the product and make sure it meets the needs. For all intents and purposes, we're going to continue to grow. I don't know that there's any specific reason to think otherwise. We're always open to the idea that if an organization comes along with the right offer, anything's possible. I think that's universally believed by myself and my investors and board. And there are a lot of organizations that may very well do that. There may be quite a few. We've already had several groups court us already for possible, acquisition. Nothing's formalized in any way because we're still kind of staying true to our focus, which is to build this bigger and address more of the problems that are obviously right there for us to have. And I think, quite honestly, from our perspective, we only really get more valuable as time goes on, especially considering what's transpired. So it's probably in our best interest to sort of just lay low until someone really does come along with the right kind of offer. Or if they don't, then ultimately it could make sense that we eventually become a public firm. But that's definitely the plan going forward.
Well, Karim, thank you so much for your time. Last question here for our listeners. Are you currently hiring or looking for investment?
I am absolutely hiring. So happy to sort of direct people to the website. We are actually about to launch a new one that's a lot more specific to our narrative than it was in the past, and it does have a careers page on it. I am also on LinkedIn personally. There are some HR team members as well on LinkedIn that people can reach out to. Just go to the simple website or go to the LinkedIn profile for Prevailion and get a hold of us there. But you are going to be quite a stint of hiring this year. And then from an investment standpoint, there is a likelihood that we're going to go for our B round probably mid-year or so. Right now, we're just sort of continuing to sort of stay focused on revenue generation and technology refinement, but investments imminently in the future for us.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. I know how busy you are with everything going on in the space right now, and really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Kyle.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.